This is episode 16 of the podcast Communicate Like This. Episode 16 is titled Judgments. Today we'll cover a pet peeve of mine, judgments. First of all, it's stupid not to have the letter E after the G in spelling judgment. It doesn't follow any known pattern of English grammar, yet there it is. Now, did you hear what just happened there? I stated an opinion. It's stupid. As a fact. That is the essence of a judgment, stating an opinion as a fact. This episode will likely have a lot of irony in it because as we talk about judgment, I'll be applying my own judgments about judgments in the course of my trying to explain judgments to you. So pull out your irony and hypocritical statements and have them at the ready to use as you deem fit to what I'm saying. I can handle it. Just insert them at the appropriate time. We'll dig into judgments in a lot more detail in this episode, but before we do, I'd like to bring back the concept of ACE artist. Remember that this is the acronym to help you remember the core values and principles this podcast is based on. Those core values and principles that form the very foundation of what it takes to communicate effectively. I've said before that if you don't know what those core values and principles are, then you'll be less able to pull them out of your communication toolbox and put them to use to reduce arguments, stress, misunderstandings, and miscommunication. It's like knowing your ABCs. If you don't know your ABCs, then you won't be able to pull them together to spell words and make sentences in order to communicate. So, are you ready for the test? Can you name, from memory, the 9 different core values and principles by now? It's only 9 things. How hard can it be if you really put your mind to it? If you really start to put some action behind your words of, yeah, I want to be able to communicate more effectively. At this point, I'd encourage you to hit the pause button on the podcast and try to name them all using the acronym ACE artist. Then hit play again. Let's see how you do. Okay. Back with me? Here's the answer for ACE artist. A, for actions in alignment with principles. C, for continuous improvement. E, for effective communication. A, for accountability. R, for respect. T, for true prioritization. I, for integrity. S, for simplification. And T, for teamwork. To bookend the acronym and to help provide an even better memory jog, I focus on the A in ACE and the last T in artist. Getting that first one out of the way in the memory test often will break the dam on the rest of the letters. So for that A in ACE, I've trained myself to think that it's the principle that has the most words, and it's what the great philosopher Marshawn Lynch says, that it's all about that action, boss. Plus, as you start reciting the core values and principles, you're taking an action. Those 3 things help me remember that the first A in ACE artist stands for action in alignment with principles. The last letter in ACE artist is the second T. For that one, I simply think that this whole journey we're on to improve communication doesn't happen without teamwork. We're all in this together, whether functionally by employing all of these communication tools or whether dysfunctionally by not using the available tools. It takes a team to make things happen. So teamwork is the anchor for the ACE artist. That's the last T in artist. No one is in this life alone, whether you think that or not. In fact, I defy you to come up with some examples of absolute, complete, and total aloneness. There's always someone else or something else involved in your life. So you're on a team, whether you like it or not. My message is to make the best of that team. So let's move from the public service announcement about ACE artist and get into the nitty-gritty of judgments. How do you recognize a judgment when you hear it? Well, most of us have an instinctive gut reaction, frequently negative, when a judgment is thrown our way. We often get defensive and try to lash back with judgments of our own about the person that just judged us in a way to deflect their judgment of us. And that's when the fight started. To prevent that argument, you have to listen to your gut and recognize when defensiveness hits you in order to overcome the cycle of attack, defend that often happens when judgments are involved. So what's wrong with judgments? Well, first of all, they're often based on unspoken assumptions, and we all know that to assume, breaking that word into its letter components, makes an ass out of you and me. Second, judgments are often negative. Third, they're often accusatory, presented in more of an attack mode than anything else. The easiest way to counter the negative effects of judgments on effective communication is to be aware of those three things and implement countermeasures against them. Unspoken assumptions? We dealt with assumptions primarily in episodes 4 and 7, but the topic is included in one form or another in many other episodes too. In short, you need to be aware that an assumption is in play and put it on the table for examination, either to validate it or disprove it. In theory, if you disprove it, then the judgment that is based on that assumption also becomes invalid. In that case, maybe an apology is in order. To deal with the second characteristic, make positive judgments. Note that statement is the opposite of don't make negative judgments. We've just eliminated that word not from the equation as we've talked about in previous episodes. You're beautiful is a judgment, but it's expressed positively versus you're not ugly. To deal with the third characteristic of a judgment, present your judgment positively or as positively as you can. Instead of you're a jerk, what if you said your actions just don't fit with the value of respect? Let's take a look at how a judgment forms. Right now, we're going to incorporate the concept of the 5 whys that we talked about in episode 13. We're going to dig down to the root causes of judgments to see how they're formed. The first step in forming a judgment is an action taken by someone. Something has to happen in order to start the process, and it's usually an action. Remember when we talked about brain filters and the brain in general in episodes 9 and 10? The main message there was that the brain often operates on its own without any so-called control by you. And the brain takes those actions in a microsecond, in less than a blink of an eye. So, if step 1 in the creation of a judgment is an action, then step 2 in that creation of a judgment is an observation of the action. At this point, we're still in the realm of neutral objective processes. These are just the facts that form the basis for a judgment. Like Jack Webb of Dragnet fame said, "Just the facts, ma'am." For those of you who don't get that reference, just Google it. It's a useful quote to keep in mind in driving effective communication. It can bring your mind back to what you really need to do in order to overcome that argument phase or stress or miscommunication or misunderstanding. Just the facts, ma'am. But then that pesky brain gets involved after step 2, because it's virtually impossible to observe something and not make assumptions about it based on your previous experience. Remember that experience isn't what happens to you. Experience is how you interpret what happens to you. So now we've moved into the realm of interpretations or assumptions in step 3 of creating a judgment. Step 4 is when the judgment is actually formed. But the leap inside your head from assumption to judgment is almost instantaneous, without any conscious thought. It just happens almost automatically. In essence, what we have now is something that's entirely made up in your head, potentially without any factual basis whatsoever. That leads to the last step, step 5 of judgments. You say the judgment out loud to another live human being. And that's when the fight started. So It's worth repeating that this all happens quickly in the blink of an eye, to go from action to observation to assumption to judgment to communication. The term snap judgment is really doubly redundant since most judgments are snap. To break that pattern, you need the awareness of the process of how judgments are formed and then consciously force yourself to intervene to stop the process. It requires some considerable introspection, but that introspection also needs to happen in the blink of an eye before you start to open your mouth and regret what came out. If you can keep your lips sealed for just an instant while you examine your judgment, you'll find you won't be the punchline in, and that's when the fight started. Take a beat, take a moment, take a minute to think before you speak. Once you've examined the validity of your judgment and your assumptions it's based on, and found it to be accurate, then let it fly. But once you've let it fly, have the awareness that you still might be wrong and have the humility to admit it if you are. That comes from inside you and nowhere else. You've got to have that internal approach that I may be wrong before you enter any conversation. Things will go much easier for you in any conversation if you take that approach. Again, this stuff is hard. It takes some self-training of your brain to get to that point of less stress in communication. Susan, one of the podcast's faithful listeners, provided this feedback on the topic of judgments and having a more neutral approach. Often we think we're being neutral when that isn't the case because it's so difficult of a thing to do. Can you just state a situation and not color it even a little bit? Can you be truly objective? Even our use of certain words, like verbs especially, take on an unspoken meaning. For instance, Susan said that it's been noted that after President Lyndon Johnson fell out of favor with the press because of Vietnam, he never, at least as reported in the media, simply just walked or navigated or even ambled along. Instead, by media accounts, he thundered. Just describing things to ourselves, never mind anybody else, in a clean, objective way is a real skill and needs a lot of practice. Journalism, in its purest and original form, was the art of describing things in that neutral fashion that wouldn't inflame passions in people by being judgmental. Just the facts, ma'am. Today, however, journalism is largely judgmental. Commentary, in essence, and opinion, is everywhere, 24/7, 365 days a year. Social media has driven the influence of unsupported judgments to an extreme so that extremes are now the norm. Because in order to be noticed, that desire being driven by ego, you have to stand out somehow. Taking an extreme position, even if not factually supported, is how you get noticed. Because it seems that for many, effective communication isn't even considered in the rush to judgment. Just get your opinion out there as quickly as possible without any consideration or accommodation of others. In my judgment, that's wrong. Insert your comment about irony here. We are lesser as a society when many arguments boil down to, well, you just suck. We are lesser as a society when people judge others without factual support or without restraint in the presentation of judgments. We are lesser as a society when piling on mindless judgments becomes a sport for the gratification of no one except the individuals who pile on. We are lesser as a society when building yourself up involves tearing others down. Which really gets to why I started this podcast. We need to fight that negative, thoughtless mentality with real communication tools and skills that will help us, as a society, better connect with one another. Okay, yes, that was a bit of an editorial rant, but one that I think was needed, despite the irony involved with the issues around judgments. Let's take a little closer look at another way of how judgments can be approached and made more accurate at least, if not just more positive. It comes down to you making adjustments to your current approach to communication. I've called those adjustments as being the use of communication tools. Adjustments are really a representation of an attitude of continuous improvement, the C in ACE artist. In football, coaches often say, keep running that play till you get it right. Now, what that really means is that while the overall play may be sound, as are the core values and principles, if you don't tweak the various components in the execution of the play, then you'll never get it right. You may need to adjust how the blocking assignments are done, or adjust the snap count, or modify any number of the hundreds of components that go into a football play. This approach is not only desirable, it's necessary. It's why coaches, or in the case of business, managers, get paid. Adjustments are not a sign of weakness or a cause to put a label of failure on something. They are a sign of strength, an indication that people have an ability to recognize changing situations and act accordingly in alignment with providing better communication as thoughtful individuals. Judgments often take the form of someone saying you're some characteristic that really doesn't apply to you. For instance, I might say something like, I believe in freedom. Now, that phrase is an action I took. I said something. If Bob, say, observed my action, then Bob's brain will run through a number of different filters in his brain based on his experience, kind of like putting information into a computer and out pops the result of all the calculations. Bob's result is to say, oh, that must mean you're a Nazi. So even though I'm not a Nazi, and I'm not sure how Bob could reach such a conclusion based on my statement that I believe in freedom, Bob has now judged me to be a Nazi. He has defined me. Now, if others hear Bob's label, they may also define me as a Nazi based on their own brain filters and processing algorithms. This is how rumors are spread. Others attempt to define you instead of you defining you. The way to combat that is to use the 5 whys and root causes to determine how Bob's brain arrived at the conclusion it did, and try to outlogic him with where his process relied on some false assumption in his processing in his brain. In this process, defensiveness certainly comes into play. If you don't keep to the objective, factual investigation of how Bob got there, but instead resort to the classic defensiveness action of attacking Bob to deflect attention away from you, well, that's when the fight started. Rhetoric is replete with judgments, and politicians are infamous for their use of rhetoric. Rhetoric often involves exaggerations of others and their actions. The purpose becomes to demonize, not communicate. To put your brain in that reptilian reactionary state where you don't think, you just judge, and then take actions on that thoughtless judgment. It's a manipulation of you to take advantage of people's general method to jump to snap judgments. For example, President Trump once said in a campaign speech, "Our Democratic opponents are driven by hate, prejudice, and rage." Really? Is there really a party that has a platform of hate, prejudice, and rage? Now, while that might get some votes, it's not going to win an election, or at least I would hope not, in my optimistic Pollyanna view of the world. Trump has applied a judgment and then counted on others to react with their own snap judgments. Beyond the point that that sounds like a projection of his own operating style, would a thinking, rational human being believe that a political party would base its platform on hate, prejudice, and rage? It's a judgment without real factual basis. There's an interesting psychological aspect of judgments that makes them so powerful. Once you make a judgment, there's a sense of self-satisfaction in having made a judgment. You've made a decision. And so the natural inclination is to pat yourself on the back for having had the courage to make a decision. You did it. It doesn't make any difference if the decision is right or wrong. Just the fact of making a decision reinforces something in you that you're in control. You're the decider, in a reference to President Bush II. That success might give you a pleasing glow inside. Just the fact that you made a decision. Hey, nice job, well done. But if you have awareness of these communication tools that you're learning, you can stop that train and look at the truth, or try to find the truth in whatever judgment is being made. I heard a quote the other day from John Harris, the editor of Politico, who said, "Put curiosity before judgment." My interpretation of that is to develop a mindset to investigate first, then judge if you must. Another quote also comes to mind that I don't know the source of, and that is, question authority. To get better at effective communication, you've got to develop an inquisitive mind. That'll lead you to uncover the root causes of arguments, stress, misunderstandings, and miscommunication, and then be able to apply the appropriate communication tool to overcome those negatives. Thanks for listening today. Before I sign off, just a couple of items to keep in mind. First, remember ACE Artist, that acronym for the 9 core values and principles. Second, per Marshawn Lynch, it's all about that action, boss. Instead of just thinking about all this stuff, put it to use. Make a conscious effort to use the tools you have at least once a day. Please spread the word via your friends, social media, and any other methods you might have about Communicate Like This. We need to get a critical mass of people who use these tools every day, and I'm hoping you can help with that. Talk to you next time.